Welcome to Play On, the Morgan Sports Law podcast. This episode is part 2 of a 2-part podcast on esports player rights. I'm Nick Williams, a barrister at Morgan Sports Law, and as I was in part 1, I'm joined by my colleague, Julia Cwierz. As before, we are joined by 3 special guests: Dom Sacco, the founder of Esports News UK, Josh Furneaux, player agent at ICM Stellar, and Alex Cwierz, analyst and academy head coach at Nordavind Gaming. Let's now start the discussion where we left off. Alex, earlier Julia gave the example of Astralis, who last October were fined by the LEC for a number of things, one of them being missing salary payments. Now, Astralis isn't a small org, it turns over millions of euros a year, and it can seem as though some esports organisations see the fulfilment of their contractual obligations as optional. Do you think that's true?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's true that they don't think they have to fulfil their promises. I think it's more so a case of there's, less pressure on them to properly fulfill things and do things fully professionally. I mean, it's also, stemming from the fact that the industry is not, fully professional yet, but it also comes down to the other side of players, for example, not pushing as hard as they perhaps could be. And also these organizations often in their previous experiences not being punished for them making mistakes or them not fully holding themselves to what they promised people. I think it's difficult to say how many malicious businesses there are in esports, but I mean, it happens in every industry, right? But it kind of comes down to those businesses and those people running those businesses will eventually be, thrown out of the leagues that they're partaking in. I mean, there's been loads of issues in previous years, and I think, at least from my perspective, there's been less major ones recently, and I hope that is the continuing trend. But I think it's more so a case of just waiting for these people to be somewhat taken out of the scene.
I think organizations really don't manage expectations well in lots of instances, and there's a huge pressure on them to win. Their whole brand, their whole ethos is built around winning. If you look at something like the Premier League, there's teams that their goal is to just finish mid-table and sell some of their players to the bigger teams and actually have a revenue stream in that sense. In esports, it's very much every team needs to win this league, regardless. And as a result, they don't manage expectations properly, and they make over promises or overreach for promises that they're likely to not be able to fulfill, and put themselves in situations where actually we can't fulfill what we set out, rather than be erring on the edge of caution and perhaps under promising and then being able to add something additional. They overreach and they overpromise and can find themselves in problems or deep water because of that.
I'd just like to clarify what I was saying before as well about players pushing. I don't mean players pushing their organization to pay them, but more so there's a general kind of culture from players that they are there because they want to play, and they're basically getting a job at it, and they're enjoying themselves, and so they much more often care about winning and competing. And so the payment is, obviously it's critical, right? But it's like a secondary thing to them.
Another major issue that came to the fore recently with the TFUE lawsuit is exploitative contract terms. Dom, now that TFUE has settled with FaZe Clan, do you think that the call to action on that kind of thing will fade, or is the next TFUE type issue just over the horizon, do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's always going to be contractual disputes in the future. That was a particularly high-profile case with a content creator that has millions of followers, and FaZe Clan, one of the biggest organisations in esports and gaming and streaming. It's hard to say. I think, to be honest, I think it was good that it came out as a big news story that everyone spoke about over the past few years, because that will help educate others. I think at first, a lot of people sided with TFUE and were thinking, oh, he's not being paid correctly. I do get this sense that, when people ask me about esports and the size of it, I do try and warn people coming in sometimes that a lot of the power is with players and publishers. And yes, FaZe Clan, big organisations like that do have power, but there's a lot of player power. Most of the money tends to go to the players from prize pools, and obviously publishers will make money from in-game microtransactions. Through esports is almost like a marketing vehicle for them. If you look at it in a cynical way, it's a lot more than that, obviously, to a lot of people. Yeah, will we see more of that stuff in the future? I believe so. And hopefully a lot of organisations and players and streamers will have learned from that story as well. to check their contracts really carefully. But on pay, whether TFUE was paid the right amount or not, I don't know. But also, him apparently trying to form his own organisation and do bits and pieces that broke parts of his contracts, apparently. It doesn't surprise me. Hopefully, we won't see much more of that in the future, but it's hard for me to say for sure. I think it will make players and organisations ensure that their contracts are watertight, and maybe they'll go over them together more carefully in the future. But I'm sure. I think we'll see. Well, I think we'll see organisations using law firms such as yours more in the future. But I think they're already doing that. Again, it comes down to communication, right? Making sure that the player or the streamer understands exactly what they're getting paid, and so on. The organisation understanding what the streamer can and can't do. Maybe that was a case where their contracts were watertight and things were broken on both ends, but I don't see this happen too much in esports at the top level. It's certainly not publicly like this. So that's pretty encouraging.
I think while we've not bashed, but spoken about some orgs that perhaps have not done things correctly, I think with the current esports ecosystem does generate or create a sense of entitlement for players, especially when they reach the top level. And a big part of that is because they go from, I don't know, if you're talking League Legends, you've got an average salary of maybe £1,500 a month or something, or €1,500 a month. If you're playing at your average ERL kind of top end team, if you then go on to make the LEC, you're averaging best part of 250 grand a year, and you've just jumped from like 1.5k a month to like 20 grand a month. And the sense of money becomes a bit lost. I mean, I'm not going to talk specific people, but when I was coaching in the LEC, we provided an office space in Twickenham, big houses in Twickenham, an office space in Berlin. When asked, like, do you have any concerns, any problems right now that we could help you, like, support you further as kind of staff? And it was, I want better pillows. You know what I mean? This is someone who's these are players that are owed like, they're paid like 25k a month, and it drives a sense of entitlement because the orgs are so desperate to keep the player on side. No matter what, they'll lie to them endlessly to keep them on side, over-promise them. There's lots of this, and it's because ultimately they want to win, and it does drive an actual not very nice sense of entitlement in some players, in which they're earning 20 grand but they can't buy their own pillow, you know? Like, and that's an example, obviously. But we're talking this drive to win, this everybody has to win attitude that does anything to bring the player on board, even if it's we can't fulfill the promise, but we're going to try and get them on our team so that they win, so that we win regardless. Does create a very it creates negatives all over the place, in my opinion, that hopefully we can remedy moving forward.
Josh, I wish you'd spoken to me about that before. I can see the headline: Excel players unhappy
True.
for wanting better pillows.
Yeah, I mean, it's an example, but it's really mad. Like, I mean, it's really mad. You think when you earn that much money that actually, I can get my own pillows, but it's opposite to that. It's like everything should be funded for me, and my money just goes into my bank. You know, it does become like that, and I think that's probably the same with footballers, same with kind of traditional sports stars. There becomes I'm entitled to whatever I want because I'm so important to this organization, because I win games for this team. I can just do whatever I want and ask for whatever I want, and I should be given what I want because I'm more important than anyone else. It's not a very nice way to especially young kids, you know, these are kids that are 17, 18 years old. They've never had what I would call a traditional job. They've not had to do something they don't like for money, and that they come through this system where we don't create, it doesn't necessarily create kind of better human beings that have so much value. They just lose the value of money because it's thrust at them so quickly.
I think gaming in general like gives you a big ego. You can see it from solo queue and whatnot. Like on Twitter, there's so much drama coming up sometimes when, you know, you have the highest level players seeing each other all the time in solo queue, so they know each other. And then one is like calling them no names or something, and the other was like, wow, you're playing EU heal, you think you're so like famous and whatnot. Like, I think ego and like entitlement in gaming in general is an issue. So I'm not surprised what you're saying about the pillows and stuff.
I mean, how do you solve that problem? Is it capping salaries? Is it better education for players? I mean, that problem is only going to get worse as more and more money flows into esports. What can you do about it?
I don't think you can, honestly, because the best players will command the best salaries. If you look at someone like Faker in Korea, or whatever he's worth, 7 figures is often reported. You know, how are you going to cap that? I mean, Riot could cap, I guess, but
I don't think that they should necessarily be capped on the money they should be given, but I think that there should be. It's really hard, and I struggled with it at times, but I was trying to build towards a culture in which nobody is replaceable, and you have to earn what you get. The issue with League of Legends, if we're talking League of Legends, big part of the issue is you have 5 players, and you don't have a team without one of those players, so you have to have the 5 players. If one of those players is not working hard and is not displaying the attitude, not displaying the culture that you're setting out as an organization, and they are put on the bench and they don't get to play next week, that's the most important thing to them. It's not the paycheck, as Alex said. If they get paid, that's great. They're getting paid for what they love doing anyway. They would do it. They did it for voluntary, most likely in the past anyway. So obviously there becomes a point where we have to start having kind of life tethers, mortgages, relationships, or whatever we need to fund, rent, anything like this, bills. So there becomes a time where it has to come from a hobby to a job. But I think it's really on the orgs to develop cultures that's not just solely like, we'll give you anything that you want as long as you win games for us. But actually, there's an attitude and there's a professionalism that you need to display. And if you're not displaying that, you're not playing next week.
We see that in top tier sports as well,
yes.
Right? On the weekend, Aubameyang was cautioned and didn't play because he arrived late, apparently.
And it didn't matter that he's Arsenal's best player. What mattered more is that he disobeyed the rules that were set out for the team. And if he got away with that, the message it sends to the other players is, well, whatever. If we're winning games, it doesn't matter what we do. We can do whatever we want. If I'm the best player in League of Legends for my team, it doesn't matter what I do because there is no repercussions for that. I get to play and I get to play anyway. If that person has to sit on that bench next week, they will soon stop doing those things. I can guarantee you that in the Arsenal case that Dom's talking about, Aubameyang will not be making that same mistake next week because he didn't care. Like the 300,000 in his pocket or whatever it might be is lovely, but when you've already got like 10 million in your pocket, the 300,000 is just additional. The point being is that he wants to play football, and same with these League of Legends players or other esports players. We're very much we've created a culture that's just no matter what you do, if you win, it's fine. You can be rude to your teammates, you can disrespect other people online, you can do whatever you want. But if you're the best League of Legends player, it's fine, and it's not fine. That's what we need to drive forward, I think, as people that work in teams, staff. It really starts with the grassroots, I think, and teaching them the way of the world, because it's really hard to stop that at the highest level unless you really kind of are very forceful.
I was just going to say, I think it will definitely improve. Something that's worth noting is that in the past, a lot of these organizations would pick up star rosters and just basically have the best players and aim for those best players. And now you're seeing a lot more teams invest in academy rosters and coaching staff, of which, in the first few seasons of League of Legends, for example, basically didn't exist at the highest level. Some teams just didn't even have coaches. And as you invest more and more in these structures to improve players and actually have the organization build a proper staff around those players, it'll become much more about how the organization deals with their roster, more so than just the star players. I mean, you mentioned Faker already. Faker was, benched for several games in the recent years. He's been having other mid laners that have been these star rookies, take games off of him on SKT, and it's something that will, I think, continue for other star players if they don't put their weight in.
I think we're very poor at this in the West compared to the Asian countries. I think we're very driven by the spotlight and very driven by the winning culture rather than creating the long-term team culture that you're trying to strive for. We're very much, no matter what it takes, we're going to win at whatever costs of the unhappiness of the team or the disrespectfulness from your players, whatever it may be. We're and a lot of it's the investment. And I mean, I experienced this firsthand at Excel, and the people that call the shots are the people that put the money in, not the people that know what they're doing. And as a result, you end up in a scenario where winning comes at you trying to build something long term. Often you don't get the long-term chance to build what you want to build, and you don't get the results immediately. You're out the door. And with that comes a pressure on staff, pressure on people to look at the short term, look at the next 3 months, look at next week's game, as to they judge the success on a weekly basis as opposed to the growth over a period of 12 months, 2 years, 4 years, 5 years, and you just get very quick, sharp increases and sharp decline, sharp increase, sharp decline, as opposed to a steady ramp up to something that's a more fruitful long-term project.
I think it's also because rosters on like lower level change very frequently. So orgs working towards some long-term goal, like they're not going to be that interested in it because the roster might change in the next split, right? So all they care about is winning, because if they win, they're going to get more and better sponsorship deals or some other deals and better players, essentially. So I think the orgs try to make the outcome be the best for themselves and not necessarily improve the gaming culture.
The trouble with that is, though, that their assets go for free at the end of each split, and they don't get any further next split than they did this split. A lot of the orgs, in my opinion, have to start taking players that are willing to accept longer term deals, that are willing to have a buyout in their contracts, regardless, even if that player is a slightly lower level than the player that won't accept that, because you have to be able to put something into, you have to create revenue stream out of selling your players, as opposed to just you sign for 2 months, the player goes for free. You sign for 2 months, the player goes for free. Ultimately, the orgs, the semi-pro orgs or whatever, a lot of them are not progressing unless all of a sudden the sponsor goes, look, I want to do a deal with them. That's the only way that they actually really progress right now. And that's very few and far between in where that occurs. There has to be more revenue streams created for these organizations by themselves, by just kind of business nous, than what currently exists.
Changing topics to something that you will no doubt have a view on, Josh, player agents. Do you think that the uptick in professional representation by lawyers and agents has been positive for esports?
I think when done well, yes, it helps for sure. So I obviously moved into agency at the start of 2021 after devoting my kind of adult career, being very on the forefront of trying to develop players, being very player development focused, bringing players through, and whenever they left me, I wanted them to be a much better player, a much better person than when they kind of started their journey with me. That extends to my agency career, and really that's my view. But obviously I've been speaking to lots of players over the last 3 months about me potentially representing them, and I've heard horror stories on the agency front as well, where ultimately the agent was in it for their cut and not in it for the players' welfare, the players' growth, the players' progression in their career. So I think the industry, the esports industry, is very amateur hour, or started as very amateur hour, and is moving in a direction, just like we were talking about kind of organization owners being incompetent. There's incompetence in every single role in esports. There's incompetent coaches, there's incompetent players. The thing is, the players easily get found out because you can't be an incompetent player for long, because you just don't get onto teams. The people behind the scenes, you often actually, the work doesn't get seen unless you work with that person, and as a result, until you work with that person doesn't get weeded out. So it takes a long time for these people to kind of be weeded out of the industry. But where competence is present, representation absolutely is really important for upcoming players, the stars of tomorrow. I think when it comes to kind of, you're very much in the absolute infancy. I mean, I'm taking on people. There's a 17-year-old lad who I've just taken on called No Name, who is a very promising UK player who's effectively made next to no salary at all yet. But I see potential in him, and I want to try and help him grow. And being 17, I mean, I've spoken to his parents, I've made links with his parents, I've spoken to him about kind of my intentions for his career and how I can help him progress. And we're building a really good relationship. And that's exactly what I want. And I think more representation should be about, is actually taking a player kind of under your wing, making up for the lack of life experience, making up for the lack of business nous, making up for the fact that this player just wants to play League of Legends and will take any rubbish deal to play League of Legends because he just loves it so much, and actually having someone there that won't accept that for you, but will try and put you in the absolute best place where you can develop, but will also take care of the fact that you're not going to be exploited because you're happy to play for free because you love the game. For me, it's really about 2 years down the line, when my time is up with this player in particular, I want to have kind of stabilized his career so that he's very much more clued up on the business side of things. And I mean, maybe in those 2 years' time we extend that deal further and I continue with that guy. But I really want to put players in a much more well-rounded, more educated position from my representation contract ends with that player to when it began. And if I can do that for as many players as possible, and ICM Stellar fully trusts me to be able to kind of lead on that project, and maybe even have other agents working alongside me or beneath me if I kind of educate them, I really think that it's something that's massive in the industry and can really develop those players. Stop a lot of this stuff happening that we've been speaking about throughout this podcast.
Do you have any insight on how young players might go about finding a good agent, other than obviously signing up with your agency? You know, when looking at the offerings that are out there, a lot of them have exploded suddenly on the scene and seem to have gained a huge number of clients in a relatively short space of time. How can a player tell the good from the bad in terms of getting an agent? It seems quite hard. Looking at
I think
websites.
It is quite difficult. I think the benefit I've got is that ICM Stellar has been successful in everything it's done over the past 25 years, and I've got that behind me. It's still somewhat questioned because it's not been done in esports. It's been done in traditional sports, in the likes of football. ICM is a very huge agency over in America with talent such as Beyonce and Samuel L. Jackson, people like this that they represent and do a great job. And I think that holds some weight in the sense of these people's careers have exploded and they've become top stars of the world in what ICM's done. And representation is representation, kind of somewhat regardless of the industry that it's in. If you can look after someone's best interest, you can look after someone's best interest. But in terms of finding the best agencies, it's a bit like I was talking about. It's a little bit too much, in my opinion, trial and error. A bit like you have a coach on your team and it's trial and error whether he's good or not. You join an organization, it's a bit trial and error of how good it is and how much they fulfill. We trialed Munster last year and it just was bad. We know that now, but that back then we were not to know. I think it's just that the agency's building a reputation. The thing that again is most followed is like, to be honest, in my eyes, it's too much like this. But if you get a good name for yourself on social media, you are good, whether you're actually good or not. And this extends to players, coaches, staff members, agencies, everything. If 1,000 people on social media say X player is the best player outside of the LEC, there's orgs that genuinely just go to that player and give that player a trial, regardless of even if they've seen them play, which is really baffling, right? Because in any other industry, it doesn't work like that. Your proof is in your own pudding, not in what everyone else tells you. But we're very social media driven. I think for me, ICM Stellar is we're building on something where the word will spread about how we have the players' best interests. Everybody says the right things, right? But ultimately, it's the actions that pay dividends in the end, and it can only be a time thing for me at the moment. But in terms of a new player going, okay, what is the best agency to go to? I think it's hard. Not enough players have representation right now. And I think as that grows, there will be better word of mouth for some and worse word of mouth for others.
We're almost out of time, but there's one last question I'd like to very quickly address before we wrap up. Player agents are obviously one solution to this. A slightly more collectivist response are unions or player associations. We've seen that tried in a number of different esports. You have the Counter-Strike Players Union, also in League of Legends in North America. You have a players association that's run by Riot. Julia, what do you see as the key challenges that might stand in the way of running effective esports players associations and unions?
An issue for players to unionize is the fact that esports career in general is rather short. Competitive players constantly change. I think like lots of players are very young. They retire, I think, before the age of 30. And there's also a threat of a game to stop being popular. Obviously, there are some titles like League of Legends or CSGO that have been going for years. There are other titles which can just stop being popular like that, right? As soon as another game comes out, they will stop being popular. So making a union for that specific game would not be beneficial for the players. I think also a lot of players haven't really been hugely proactive in trying to make a change. For example, as you mentioned, the NALCS Play Association was actually made by Riot Games. So it didn't come from the players themselves. It was Riot that was like, okay, you should have that so that your right would be protected, which can be argued that it was just a marketing stunt. So I think those are the issues. And also, when you have the players, they're mostly young players. And so running these sort of unions requires some certain amount of maturity. So you need those young players to want to take up those leadership roles, and players who care about their rights and who know that they have rights and they want to take care of them. So from player perspective, from a player who is 16-year-old, because those are the players that actually take part in those leagues, they are not as aware as a player who is 23, let's say. So I think those are the biggest issues in forming a union currently.
And Dom, do you think we'll be seeing more players' unions and associations going forward despite those challenges?
It's hard to say. If you look at the success of existing player associations, I mean, I think when the Counter-Strike Professional Players Association was set up, there was a lot of positivity around that. There's also been some criticism of it as well. It's really hard to say unless I think ultimately, like, the intentions are good, right, from the players' associations. So I think it'd be nice if we can get to the point where every game has a player association. But it's like organisations we were talking about earlier. You want to make sure that the player associations are properly run. You probably need the publishers involved in them. You know, there are third-party organisations out there like the Esports Integrity Commission, I think it's called ESIC, which works with some publishers to clamp down on match fixing, you know, ensure there's the right penalties in place and so on. With player associations, yeah, you need to make sure that, well, who's running them? You know, are they credible? What are the rules in place? Are there good links with the publishers? And then as well, beyond player associations, there's lots of national associations now around the world, like the British Esports Association. There's ones in France, all over the place. I think we'll see more of those bodies that aren't really governing bodies, and they don't have power as such, but they're established to help promote esports in their different regions. I think we'll see more of them. I think most of the countries around the world, well, a lot of countries around the world have those associations already. But again, in some places, in some instances, there's a lack of, I don't know, integrity, or, you know, making sure that people have good background or understanding of esports.
Do you think that these, like, stuff like British Esports Association stuff, Dom, obviously your experience working there and things, could, I mean, get more involved with they're very much on the grassroots level, very much introducing people to esports, very much on the educating parents on like their kids getting into esports and such. Do you think that they could get more involved in the actual esport and helping add a professional outlook to, I mean, like maybe educating some org owners, trying to support teams in the disputes like we had at Munster, just basically a place where people involved in esports in that country can seek counsel, really? Because I feel like, I mean, I've had interactions with British Esports Association, but very much on a, how can I help them promote esports to other people?
I do think there's a space for it now, more now than there was a few years ago when it was set up 5 years ago or so. It's about to celebrate its 5th anniversary. There was a bit of resistance to that in the past. Who are these guys? Why are they can't govern anything? Whereas now, I think there is more of a need for that. And I think you might see British Esports working a bit more closely with some of the organisations in the UK, possibly. But yeah, it's what that looks like.
I guess.
What powers do they have at the end of the day?
There may be some conflict of interest now if, like, British Esports Association, for instance, people that fund that or go into that actually have shares or investment into certain teams like Resolve. Now there could be some conflict of interest there, right?
Yeah,
because
exactly.
They're investing their own money into one particular organisation in the UK, and why would they then help the other esports organisations that are going against that team? But I think perhaps that's something that needs to be looked at. But I think these esports associations, in my eyes, should, while introducing new people is brilliant, actually make what we've got a good and sustainable system that it's currently not. I think stuff like the British Esports Association would have much more access to kind of brands that were interested in getting into esports, into as well as introducing grassroots players, introducing grassroots coaches. Maybe they could put on workshops to help players to understand what is becoming a pro. What does that mean? Like what? So going from your bedroom playing League of Legends or esport to becoming a professional player. Stuff for coaches, stuff for staff members, stuff for running businesses. Lots of room for education in the space that is currently not exploited.
Josh,
Yeah,
I'd
definitely.
absolutely love to talk to you about conflicts of interest, but I think that would be a whole other hour of podcast recording. And unfortunately, we have run out of time. So on that note, we'll wrap things up. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us and being so generous with your time. It's been a really interesting discussion, and we're incredibly grateful for you taking the time out of your day, even at this early hour of the morning.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So that concludes part 2 of this 2-part series on esports player rights. For analysis and articles on athletes' rights issues, please go to our website, www.morgansl.com. If you're interested in joining our mailing list, or there are any topics that you would like to see addressed in a future podcast, please email us at podcasts@morgansl.com. Finally, please connect with us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram and Facebook for articles, updates and news. We hope that you enjoyed listening and will join us for future episodes. Play on.